I first want to say Representative Clem gives his regards. I am his replacement, and I am worse in many regards.
You're better looking.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Vicki Berger just impacted her own reputation for honesty. I want to start with the questions that I heard, or at least some semblance of them. One is, will this be a legislative body that plays to the middle? Will this be a legislature of moderates? I had 4 answers to this. Yes, no, I hope so, and it depends. And I'll start with a portion of the depends. I think in part it depends on how we define that. I think that we have created sort of a construct of how government is structured, and there's sort of a left and there's sort of a right, and then it creates a spectrum. And I think that view, while very often helpfully descriptive, is in a larger measure hogwash. Okay? There is no particular philosophy that I can find that would place, say, one's view on the death penalty alongside one's view on regulations of the private sector. There is no particular ideology that can very clearly construct the connection between one's feeling about a woman's right to choose and one's feelings on freedom of speech, stronger or weaker. Right? We tend, I think, to make these descriptions not based on philosophy or ideology, but based on a description of power. Right? That political parties are best understood, I think, as conglomerations of power, not as consistent manifestations of coherent ideas. And I think that will be a better descriptor of what happens in the legislature than any we will all have a particular centrist kumbaya moment and land around similar ideas around a diverse array of things. I think it matters how we define the middle. If what we mean by the middle is places where we can agree and compromise, the answer is yes, and I hope so, because agreement and compromise will be necessary. If the answer is following whatever set of lobby interests has the most cross-cutting relationships that cross party, my answer is, my guess is yes, but I don't know if I hope so. If the answer of middle is where we try to get on the same side of the table approaching a common problem and identify common problems and identify commonly held options for solutions, then very much I hope so, and I'm not sure. And for that, I mean, sort of my office's mantra on that regard is, it's not merely a matter of finding, we hope, a place on a false, sometimes, political spectrum. It is not about finding a location on that spectrum. It's about finding the answer. I think we will have to come in collaborative spirit to find answers. I think if we merely try to aim at our dartboard slightly differently, then I don't know that we'll solve the people's business any better, nor do I think we'll be truer with our aim. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Second, impact to the governor, or impact on the governor, and both. That's an interesting question, one that I haven't probably considered fully, and I'm relatively new to this process, and very new, as even are very experienced people, to sort of to the split power arrangement. So I think all of us, I think, rightly tread in with some humility. I mean, one reality is we have a moderate governor, and one that was not the first choice of many of the dominant interest groups that fund Democratic Party campaigns, and is willing to explore redesigns of government processes that can make the current occupants and participants in those processes somewhat nervous. I think that's, for the governor, for the state, for those interest groups, for Democrats, for Republicans, good news and bad news, right? But I do think that I could imagine a couple different phenomenons, I don't know, I could imagine where the governor doesn't want to be sort of Dr. No again, and so is very interested in being the Dr. Yes. I could also imagine that an overly partisan fervor in the House could flip a switch emotionally for him to remind himself of his inner Democrat, and get more partisan than otherwise I think is preferring to be. And the best quote on relationships with the executive I've heard was by Grover Norquist, and says anybody who claims to have a strong relationship with the executive doesn't. And I think none of us want to sort of overstate our relationship with the governor. I have some perspective on how he sees the world, and I know not only his talking point preference, but his soul preference is to come from a place when he even defines it to some degree as finding a place on the spectrum that is sort of the middle portion. So I'm interested also to see how that plays, and I think the conduct of the legislature will impact what kind of governor we have, is my own hunch. And that's what I'd say about that. Next, I'll say a few thoughts about the rules. I find it very interesting. We have a set of House rules. This was not my insight. It was by a senior member of the legislature. I thought it was one of the smartest things I've heard said about this. We have a set of rules that are built around the idea that a political party is built and it wins a majority of seats. And that's how the whole thing is built, right? So you elect a person, because you got to get the work done. So you elect a person and a little handful of other people, and that person, with some advice, selects committee chairs, and those committee chairs pick which bills have a chance to happen or not. And all built around this idea of a party wins. What is interesting to me, and I guess I'll acknowledge somewhat disappointing to me, is and I say that not wanting, and because few of them are in the room, not wanting to cast aspersions on the people who worked very, very hard to get to a deal. You know, I don't want to sort of walk around the battlefield and shoot the wounded, but rather want to sort of laud their work, right? It was a hard thing to do. But I have to acknowledge a little bit of disappointment that we started from a place of a set of rules and traditions based around the idea that a side wins, when a side didn't win, right? You know, the Democrats lost more seats than Republicans, so you could sort of say, you know, who felt better on election night. I know who felt better on election night. But in terms of who controls more seats, they don't. But we still sort of worked from those rules backwards and sort of then did them twice, right? Sort of we'll do everything that we've done. Had we had more time, and only at places like the Salem City Club can we get, only places like the Salem City Club can we, sort of even explore ideas like this. But to me, we started a legislative session too early. We just started a legislative session with a greater period of time after the election. So we have more time to reflect on what ought to happen after the election, rather than doing just it based on political promises during the election, which were primarily made to build power and win, rather than to explore the most important answers to the most important problems. Had we had more time, I think we might have been able to explore something very different from our current set of rules. And had we done that, it would have been interesting if we'd said, imagine a nonpartisan legislature, what would it look like? Not imagine a bipartisan legislature, not imagine like two chambers within a chamber, but imagine a nonpartisan legislature, what would that look like? To me, that's a fascinating question. I don't know the answer to it. I also acknowledge there wasn't really time to ask and answer that question, because all we'd be talking about now, had the good negotiators not reached a deal, is why the heck didn't you get a deal done? Right? So they had to get a deal, so you had to work on the old rules. But I find that, I must admit, somewhat unfortunate. We have co-everything. I find that interesting. That creates some interesting results. For a short period of time, I don't think I'm going to remain this necessarily, but for a short period of time, I was the co-vice chair of the subcommittee on higher education. Okay? It looks like right now that I might become the vice chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee for General Government, which means right now I am the prospective interim vice chair of the Ways and Means Subcommittee for General Government. Ladies and gentlemen, that's called power. I don't know. You're looking for where it is? That's where it is. I think the rules require a culture of collaboration and accomplishment. The rules themselves don't require that, but in order for us to do anything, the rules necessitate it, I should say. The rules don't impose it, but they require it, might be a better way to say it. And rather than mutually assured destruction. There are new rules about getting things done. We're going to have to develop comfort with using those rules in a friendly way. The rule of 31, the idea that 31 members of the legislature should make a vote, That was altered somewhat. That was an important principle for some of the negotiations, and that was changed to move to a petition process, and that'll be new, right? It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I am not sure. And then last, I'll start with some principles that I think might be helpful to move in the direction of that culture. Some will be finding unlikely allies who have common ground. Just about every legislator I know has examples of this in their own sort of repertoire. Everybody kind of advises their own autobiography. I'll use two examples in my own. I got thrown into one and not thrown into the other. I got thrown into working on a piece of water legislation and found and worked with a Republican co-sponsor who worked the bulk of this session trying to reach some compromise that could work with the stakeholders. And we built in that process a pretty strong relationship. It was one of the more enriching experiences of my very brief legislative career. It made the process matter more, that it felt like the people in the process were caring about one another. We did Representative Berger and I co-sponsored a piece of healthcare transparency legislation, which I hope at least helped inform a little bit of the healthcare reform bill that was passed. We did a transparency bill that had two Democrats and two Republicans as the chief co-sponsors, and they were very much sort of odd bedfellows in many respects. We disagree on many issues, but found agreement in some process things, trying to make government a little more good. So that's one, finding unlikely allies, finding common ground, I think will be helpful to us. Second is being hard on the problem but soft on the people. As sort of an old saw, it was reminded to me by a friend of mine who is the CEO of a company. It's actually a company that makes biodegradable diapers, which I find good lunch conversation. But finding that, so somebody here is Representative Cameron, and he and I agree on some things, disagree on some things, but I like him a lot, and he tolerates me. And we have together played an upper deck poker game. It's been fun, and I think sort of building personal relationships while we work through problems will be another important principle. And then the third and the thing I really want to leave us with, and this is less prediction and more hope, and less even lobbying of the legislators and staff that are in the room, but also lobbying of the people who pay attention to the process. That as we think about defining the middle, as we think about what our system of government requires, that we think not merely about which lobby or lobbyists we are preferring, or which interest groups is our favorite collaboration of interest groups, but rather that we think about the biggest problems that our state is facing, and we try to apply more public interest energy to solve those problems. To me, that is the biggest challenge of our system of government. It is not merely a left or right problem, it is a forward problem. It is not merely a bigger or smaller government problem, it is a better government problem. And that is not going to come merely because of a set of rules that are created by a legislature or the existing power infrastructure that applies influence upon it. That will come or not come based on the willingness of a greater number of citizens to engage in the process and provide power that is a little bit separate from the current triangulation power analysis. That to me is the biggest thing we've got to figure out. How do we figure out how to solve our biggest problems and work on that together? I could say more about that, but I could also say less. Mostly I want to just say thank you very much for including me. It's a really fun conversation.